Hi, welcome to Podshoot, everyone. It's July 3rd, the day before Independence Day, and today I have a guest and a topic that is very fitting for this day before Independence Day. I have Connor Boyack, and he is the president of Libertas Institute, and we're going to talk today about how he and how in general we should fight for a free society. Thank you for giving me some of your time today, Connor.
Thanks for having me, Amy. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, now I'm not sure if many people have heard of Libertas Institute, but I know that many people have heard of one of your big projects, which is the Tuttle Twins. You have the book, which has sold over 5 million copies. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a book series with 30 something books spanning from
Wow.
toddlers all the way up to teens. And so there's quite a variety depending on the age of the kids.
Okay, and then you also have now a cartoon series.
Mhm.
And if you say that the Tuttle Twins books go from toddler all the way up to teens, what age is the cartoon series targeted at?
What we really strived for with the cartoon was to make something like the secret sauce of the books is that even though particular books have an age range, for example, I've got right here The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is our book all about the Fed and inflation and money. This is in our children's series, which typically is for kids, let's say 6 to 11, somewhere around there. But the
Okay.
magic over the years has been, even though this is a kids format, plenty of teenagers will read it because the ideas in here are kind of fresh and interesting. They've never really encountered them before. And then the parents are often learning new things as well because they never learned this stuff in school when they were growing up. So the cartoon takes a similar approach. It's like age, 5 to 10. It's just a silly, fun kids cartoon, but we put a lot of humor in there that only the adults are going to get. And so it's really fun for whole families to watch because the parents will laugh. The kid says, "Why was that funny?" They pause the cartoon. There's a teaching moment to kind of explain something. So we're trying to create an experience, a learning experience for the whole family together.
I watched one episode of the cartoon and it was something about when laws go awry. I can't remember the exact title, but I noticed that there was a vocabulary word in there with which most kids would not be familiar, which was bidet. And
Mhm.
you would explain it to them, I guess, so that they could have a moment of a little bit of bathroom humor or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
So
Well, and,
interesting.
and I should say, Amy, to build on that, we use a lot of words in our books and the cartoon about topics these kids have never heard before. I mean, so we're talking to them about something like inflation or spontaneous order or praxeology or all these different terms that kids never will have encountered. So what we try and do is couch all of these new terms in fun stories so that the kids become curious about them. They see a particular term or word used in context of a fun story that they're engaging with. So maybe they understand a little bit of what that term might mean, but then they're asking mom or dad, or they're going to the back of our book where we have a little glossary and we're like, hey, here's, to better understand these terms. Really, it's about exposing whole families to these new ideas. So for most of them, these terms are going to be new. So we're trying to find very easy and fun ways to help them understand what these ideas are, what they mean.
And you've sold a lot of these books. Have any of them been adopted in schools?
Yeah, we have, gosh, hundreds of schools across the country using the books, predominantly private schools, micro schools, some charter schools. For the government schools, we typically have renegade teachers, I'll call them, who are like-minded and will use this in their classroom, but it's not, Common Core aligned and it's not whatever. And so it's usually a supplementary thing on a teacher's initiative. But there's a number of schools that are using this more like woven into their curriculum, and so that's very heartening to see. Our audience is like half homeschool, half everything else. And so for the homeschoolers, they'll use our materials because we have books and we have curriculum and we have a bunch of resources. So for the homeschoolers, it's like, hey, here's our curriculum to learn about American history, and then we have two big American history books. But for the kids who go to, say, a government school, for them, this isn't curriculum. They already have a big curriculum that they're having to go through in school. The Tuttle Twins for them is more, I'll say, a counter agent, where the parents are like, look, we know like you have to go to public school for whatever reason, that's just our decision, but we know your head's being filled with all kinds of nonsense. So when we're home together at bedtime, let's read a chapter in the Tuttle Twins story and make sure that we're, teaching some true principles to you.
Right, right. No, I noticed that with exception of that last mention, you use the term government schools. And yeah, I try to do that as well. Sometimes I slip and say public school, just like you did the one time. But why do you prefer that term?
So I wrote a book. I'll share the story this way. So I'm just grabbing the book right here. 41 years ago, the Reagan administration published a report that followed from a group called the National Commission on Excellence in Education. And the group spent about 18 months going around the country trying to understand how are we doing with education in America in terms of the curriculum, the assessments and test scores, pedagogy, training for teachers, all the rest, right? It was a year and a half. They do this review, they publish a report, and the name of the report was A Nation at Risk. And in the report, among other things, they said that America's educational foundations are being overwhelmed by a rising tide of mediocrity. And that if a foreign government had attempted to impose upon America the very mediocre educational performance that now exists today, we might have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we've allowed it to happen to ourselves. That was 41 years ago they said that. So last year, a buddy of mine, Corey DeAngelis, and I put together a book called Mediocrity. So here's Lady Liberty drowning. There's a COVID mask floating around in there.
Oh gosh, no. Okay.
And so the idea was for the 40th anniversary of that report, which was in April of 2023, we published this book, Mediocrity, which has 40 chapters, each of which goes through the many problems with the government schools. But to answer your question, in the very introduction, we say, look, most people call these public schools, they used to be called factory schools. Decades ago, the common term for these schools was factory schools because they were seen in a positive sense of training kids to have good factory jobs and so forth in a bygone era. And so from our perspective, these are government schools. It's government money, it's government instruction, it's government top-down curriculum, committees and school boards. It's all political. It's government controlled. And can you really expect a government to teach the rising generation anything that is unflattering or threatening to that very government? I think no. So we thought it was important to, really kind of clarify, let's not use these flowery terms that mask what's really going on. If you want to surrender your children to the government for indoctrination during their most intellectually formative years, more power to you. But that's not what I want for my kids. And increasingly for many other families, they're making the same decision to pull their kids out and pursue an alternative.
When you say mediocrity, it's not just the fact that the substantive ideas that they're being taught are ideas that will, be consistent with accepting a government that takes a lot of control over every aspect of our lives. Not necessarily totalitarian yet here in the United States, but increasingly taking more and more control over every aspect of our lives. And they want kids, they want to turn out kids who will accept this, right? And pay their taxes towards it and et cetera. But mediocrity to me connotes more than that. It's the fact that the kids just don't even have basic skills in reading, writing, knowledge of basic history, et cetera. I think you mean that as well, right?
Absolutely. The government corrupts everything it touches. It doesn't do anything well. I mean, we don't trust it with our mail. We groan every time we have to go to the post office. We hate the TSA. We know it's security theater. They corrupt our money, which corrupts our society. Like everything the government touches, it corrodes. Why in the world would we then entrust our children to an institution with such a poor track record? You're exactly right. Mediocrity is substantive in nature. We highlight in that book, for example, a fun little experiment, not experiment, but an example from a century ago, what 8th graders were expected to learn. And so we highlight some different tests and, things that they were being asked. And most adults couldn't even understand or correctly answer questions like that today. So there has been a progressive dumbing down of education in America. And the question I always ask when I'm out public speaking on this kind of stuff is, If you were in power, if you were in charge of the government, you're the president, you're the dictator, you're the whatever, do you want to govern a populace of inquisitive, independently minded, entrepreneurial, critically thinking individuals? Or would you prefer to govern a distracted, highly entertained, historically illiterate group of individuals who couldn't learn from the past in order to prevent its mistakes from repeating in the future? The question is, answers itself. And so I think that's why we've seen a degradation and why we have the mediocrity that we do, is because we've entrusted the government with it, and it has every incentive to reduce its quality in order to dumb down the populace, to make it easy for the, political shenanigans that we're suffering under today.
I mean, I myself am a product of those schools, unfortunately. And the era in which the report that you mentioned was written was an era when I was in those schools. So I'm not exactly sure how I survived with half a brain cell to rub against another one, but somehow I don't know. I mean, obviously there are kids, I guess, who survive these schools and they end up reading a lot more on their own and just going out there and analyzing the world around them, and somehow survive, maybe when you go on to higher education. But this is a theme that I've seen on your social media feeds, how ill prepared students are to go on to that higher education, even those who are tremendously motivated. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And parents want what's best for their kids. They don't want their kids to be dumbed down. The problem is so often, and part of the reason why we wrote mediocrity, is that when you were in school, in I guess around the 80s, and when I was in school, things were much different. I mean, they were still not great, which is why in 1983 they were saying that we have mediocrity then, but it is way worse now. And you only need to scroll libs of TikTok or like other accounts to see how much activism and political ambition there is in these institutions that should just be about academics and developing curiosity and kind of open-minded debate of different ideas. We don't really have that. We have the closing of the American mind, as Jonathan Haidt has pointed out. So parents don't, they want what's best for their kids. I think in a lot of cases, they just haven't fully understood how bad things are in the government schools, how increasingly worse they've gotten. Proverbial frog in a pot of boiling water, not really noticing the slow decline. So for us, writing that book in particular, it was kind of a wake-up call to be like, hey, like, check out all these examples of why there is such mediocrity. COVID, of course, was a big wake-up call for a lot of families, which led to skyrocketing, homeschool participation rates. And so, but a lot of parents are like, they see the schools as basically free babysitting, and they've grown accustomed to a lifestyle that takes advantage of that situation. And they look at themselves like you did. I call myself a product of the public fool system. And
okay, that's good. I'll have to steal that. I'm so sorry, but I will.
I stole it from someone else. I don't even remember. And
Okay.
and so look, I survived, right? You survived. We're intelligent people. It's not that there's carnage everywhere.
I'm not as well read as I'd like to be. I need to fix that. Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
right. And
Yeah.
so, but nonetheless, many parents might look at themselves and say, I turned out all right, so my kids will be fine. Yeah, sure, there's problem X or Y or Z, but look at me. I'm a functioning adult. My kids will be fine as well. And so, what we're trying to do is really empower these parents to realize the problems are more significant than you've anticipated. The solutions are far easier and more abundant than they were a decade or two ago for you to pursue alternative education paths for your kids. And the outcomes skyrocket in success compared to the kind of traditional government school outcomes that you see across the country, especially in blue states and heavy metro areas where they have massive spending and like dismal outcomes when you look at assessments and other performance metrics. So it's really just trying to give people the red pill, the wake up call to say there's a better way, and it's not as daunting as it used to be. And sure, in the 80s, the homeschoolers were the weird ones, but increasingly the kids in the government schools today are the weird ones, and the normal kids who can look adults in the eye and carry on a conversation and be independent minded and clear thinking. Those are the homeschoolers and the micro schoolers and so forth that are trying to get outside of this system and pursue a better path.
Thought on charter schools. Are you seeing anything promising out of the charter schools?
No, they're lipstick on a pig. They're still government schools with a little bit of a twist. So some are better than others. Some have more liberal charters. A number of charter schools use the Tuttle Twins book. So uh, do I like them better than just the run of the mill government school? Sure, you can find these little pockets of interest. We have a charter school nearby, for example, where they're all about entrepreneurship. So the whole
Hmm.
kind of ethos of the school builds all the curriculum around building a little micro business and learning about money and so forth. I'm like, okay, that's cool. That's at least functional and relevant to their lives. There's another charter school nearby where I live where they're more like founding fathers, classical liberalism, free markets, and so they really make an emphasis to acquire curricula and textbooks and so forth that teach from that particular lens. So, I mean, yeah, marginal improvements, but they're still top-down authoritarian instruction models where kids are required to learn the same things in the same way at the same age as all of their peers.
Right.
And I just think education itself needs a massive disruption. I wrote a book years ago called Passion Driven Education about how we can use children's interests of what they're actually curious about and build a curriculum around that, which they then eagerly want to learn because it centers around their interests rather than requiring them to conform to the system and say, thou shalt learn these things because some faceless curriculum committee decreed that, 35 years ago. So again, especially with post COVID, there's so many options now where whether you're homeschooling or you want to do a micro school or even charter schools, there's just an abundance of options. And so I'm not one to say government schools are evil, therefore you're a bad parent if you put your kids, there. I get it. There's trade-offs, there's reasons, there's whatever. But I just want parents to be making very informed, intentional decisions after surveying and realizing the abundance of options that now exist today and how comparatively easier it is to homeschool or pursue some of these other options compared to years past. So it's really just saying, let's make informed decisions before you just settle for the path of least resistance.
One minor point about the mindset of parents looking at these government schools or schools generally as babysitters for them. Even the start time of schools is geared for the convenience of the parents, not for the well-being of the kids. I would
Right.
say around everywhere in the country, kids are drug out of bed when their melatonin levels are not really consistent with waking up, you know, fed some kind of breakfast. They're probably not even hungry and sent off to school at these ridiculously early hours for them, given their melatonin cycles. And I know this because I taught at the Air Force Academy.
Mm.
And when I first went there and I got the faculty orientation, they talk about what the melatonin cycles of the cadets who are just 18 years old, what they're like. And they were not even awake properly before, say, 8:30 in the morning, and classes started at 7:30.
Mm.
And then I kid you not, the Air Force Academy decided this very semester after I started teaching there that they would start classes at 7 instead of 7:30, after having given us as faculty an orientation presentation saying they're not even awake.
Weird.
That lasted only one semester. They went back to 7:30 at least. But, again, if we're going to optimize instruction for kids, you want to give them the best chance possible to be able to engage with and absorb the material that they're trying to learn. And I think even physically, we don't set them up for success.
And I agree with that. To put an exclamation point on it, I think one of the most striking things that I saw during COVID was parents realizing how much wasted time there is. Like, why wake these kids up early, as you point out, and subject them to 7 hours sitting behind different desks, swapping every 55 minutes, for the next
Yeah.
class. When at home during COVID or otherwise, if you're homeschooling and so forth, you can absorb and learn and act on the same amount of information in like maybe 2 hours, 3 if you're pushing it, right? And so parents increasingly were like, what the heck are my kids doing all day in school? Because I give
Mhm.
them their little assignments and worksheets and we go over whatever. And then, an hour and 45 minutes later, coming and saying, hey, dad, can I go play now? I'm done with my stuff. You're like, wait, what? Like, how does that compute? And so you realize that we've conditioned children in the system to conform to the system that has massive amounts of inefficiencies, heavy indoctrination. They're teaching to kind of the lowest common denominator. So the gifted kids are insanely bored. The Elon Musks of the world hate the system, as I did, because you're creative, you're ADHD, you're thinking outside the box, wanting to do different things. I'm the kid, in class, it's like, why do we need to learn this? And to which the teachers say, put your hands down, it'll be on the test. So I hated school, which in my mind meant then that I hated learning. I kind of felt disinterested in reading for leisure and curiosity. And so, and then I went to college because that's what you do. And you got to get a college degree. And I was on this like conveyor belt only after college to kind of have some life events that shook me up and made me look backwards and be like, I didn't need to go to college. Actually, I wish I didn't. And all this wasted time. I've now found my life path, when I'm 28, whatever I was. But man, like you said, wanting to be more well-read, wishing that, you were more well-read. I look back and I'm like, there's so much time I wasted that I could have been reading and learning and doing these more interesting things. But I had to be the good little student and stand on the conveyor belt and just go through at the same speed as everybody else. So it's inefficient. It's ineffective. There's so many better options available. And look, at the end of the day, like I said, I'm kind of agnostic on what parents decide. I just want them making the right decision that's fully informed after they understand truly the abundance of these options that exist. But my vantage point with Tuttle Twins is like, I don't care how you educate your kids. If they're going to the government schools, that's fine. You can still use these books. In fact, you should use these books to kind of, deprogram them in your home from any of the nonsense they're learning in school. So really our effort is kind of holistic of however you educate your kids. We kind of don't care, what we've provided for you is a equal opportunity educational program.
Yeah, you have material to help anybody, however they're going to be tackling this project of getting their kids educated and prepared for a life where they can be happy and successful, right?
And Amy, lest I forget, I really want to emphasize this point that kind of takes us a little off of this topic, and that is, for us, this is very mission driven. And here's what I mean by that. If I can call it the freedom movement, however you want to broadly define that, of different nonprofits and for-profits and activists and people trying to further the cause of liberty. I think we have been fighting a losing battle for decades. We ourselves have been very inefficient. And among the reasons why, in fact, my top reason, if not in the top three, is that we let our ideological adversaries educate our children collectively, generally speaking, of course, during their most intellectually formative years. And only when they're adults do we, generally speaking, think, okay, now they're, teenagers, they're getting ready to vote, they're an adult. Let me now talk to them about some of these economic and political and civic type ideas. Our think tanks and activist organizations are all geared around talking to adult voters who by that age are increasingly set in their worldview and ways, especially so with the advent of social media, where now you got 9-year-olds who have political opinions because of TikTok. So from my vantage point, like you probably heard this quote, Amy, that politics is downstream of culture.
Right.
And this has been around for a few decades. I agree with it. I do think we need more cultural efforts. It's part of, why we wanted to do a cartoon, is to just get more cultural shift out there to then have a downstream impact on politics. So I agree. Politics is downstream of culture, but I think that's incomplete. I think culture is downstream of the family. And I think if we truly want to have transformative impact over the long term, sure, we have to have our short-term battles, our litigation fights, going to the Capitol, duking it out. Right. We got to do that. We do that with our things.
And I think, the success of some politicians, for example, Javier Milei, in actually implementing some of these ideas and just getting to watch that is, for me, as fuel, kind of spiritual fuel giving, as art, right? To actually see some in the world. So there's a time and a place, but go on. Sorry.
I agree. And to use your example, I mean, Millet is, cutting the Ministry of Women and Gender Studies and pink rainbows and whatever, right? Like, he's making all these cuts. But give that 10 years, he'll be out of office, and the pendulum might swing the other way if the populace does not have the right mindset, the right kind of cultural perspective to support and reinforce these ideas. So if culture is downstream of the family, then I ask our movement to kind of reflect and say, what do we do that has any relevance to a family dinner table discussion? right? Are we reaching and teaching families? Are we supporting them with activities and events and materials and curriculum and programming and other things? Are we helping parents help their kids? Are we creating any value in the family living room that makes any sense for them to talk about our policy papers and our white papers and our
Right.
symposia and our books or whatever, right? So fine, like put out your stuff for adults. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but my heavens, like we have been derelict in our strategy to have a sustainable outreach program whereby we can kind of cultivate the rising generation and create this pipeline that can sustain the freedom movement and grow its size and its impact. And so I'm looking around like at all these other organizations in our movement thinking there is mass inefficiency, huge waste of donor dollars. A lot of it is just patting ourselves on the back and spinning our wheels and looking good and putting our hot takes on Twitter. And I got no time for that. Like I'm here to change hearts, minds, and laws. And I'm a very impatient person. I want to see actual impact. I want to see the Javier Malays of the world actually making progress, and let's get these people in office. So for me, it's part like, yes, I'm out there creating these books and these materials with my team to create that value and educate families with these ideas. But the other part of me feels kind of like the prophet in the wilderness of like rebuking the people of their sins and say, hey, freedom lovers, like, we got to fix this, because if we keep doing what we've been doing in the past and we continue to let the left so-called, educate the rising generation, we're going to be forever losing because we're simply not competing. We got to compete. If we believe in a marketplace of ideas, the marketplace has shifted. It's no longer adults. It's not even college campuses. Now it's increasingly high schools and middle schools where these ideas are being absorbed and inquired about by these kids and exposed to. We have to get in there and compete. And I look around and basically nobody else is doing it, which saddens me. On the one hand, great, we have kind of a monopoly. We'll go in there and do the best we can. But from a mission perspective, we need 1,000 more organizations doing what we're doing if we're truly going to make a dent in the problem that we have.
Yeah, I mean, just, for some kids, maybe they don't particularly like the Tuttle Twins. There's nothing wrong with it, but kids have different
Yeah,
tastes.
of course.
And so we would need more people to come in and create different books, different cartoon series that could appeal to them. What would you say to someone who wonders how early it is to even really start talking to kids about politics, right? So we might say, that, and I believe this strongly, actually, so I'm not going to play even devil's advocate. I think they're teaching politics in school way too early, and I don't know that the right answer is, well, they have their bad political ideas, let's counter them with good ones. I think that kids maybe shouldn't even have to think or talk about politics until a certain age. Aristotle had something like that, right? In his Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about who is a good student of ethics. And it is someone who's had enough life experience and et cetera. And to go back, to my example of teaching at the Air Force Academy, we taught Nicomachean Ethics, of course, as part of their core class. And I would ask them, do you believe that Air Force cadets are ready to be good students of ethics at their young age? And of course, they are people who have at a very young age accepted a lot of responsibility, namely a commitment to a military force, right? It's got all sorts of ethical implications, and it takes a lot of responsibility, and they're courting a lot of risk and danger by committing to serve in the military. So you'd say, okay, certainly they have a lot of experience and they should be good students of ethics. On the other hand, they live in a dorm room type environment, so it's almost like an extension of high school socially, and they're rather immature in some ways. And so we would have that discussion. But, point being, if I had issues and could have a discussion about whether an 18-year-old Air Force cadet was even ready to fully digest these ideas, certainly the young kids are too young. And, maybe countering it with better ideas is not a full solution. Maybe it's better to remove them, as you say, entirely, ideally to a different sort of education where they are taught things that are pedagogically and ethically correct for their age level,
Yeah.
right?
It's a fair argument. It's a fair question, one we've been asked many times before. My perspective on it is perhaps from kind of a realist or even fatalist perspective, the toothpaste is out of the tube. And with social media and everything else, kids are just going to be exposed to these ideas. It's almost like, let's not talk to children about the birds and the bees until they're dating or until they're,
Right.
sexually active, right? When they're like watching these like, semi-pornographic videos on social media. So there's an element of like, it's out there. So we need to give our kids a framework through which they can kind of evaluate these ideas or have some understanding. The other thing too is I think this is highly contextual. Am I saying that we need to sit down 9-year-olds and have them listen to Leonard Peikoff's lectures on philosophy? Of course not, right?
Right. Or read Atlas Shrugged, please not. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's contextual. It's like, hey, my 6-year-old wants to do a lemonade stand. Great. Let's talk about entrepreneurship. Let's talk about free enterprise. Let's talk about money and trade and barter. And these are things that are contextual. They're relevant to his life. We had a story some months ago that a dad emailed in. He was listening to the local NPR affiliate, and inflation was the topic of conversation. They had on the economist from the local like community college to interview him about inflation, and the dad is in the car with his kids in the back seat. And they're all Tuttle Twins readers, and which is why he emailed me the story. And so they're listening to the radio, and the host asks the economist, like, why are prices so high? What can be done about this? To which the economist replies, well, have you seen the price of the Taylor Swift concert tickets lately? They're astronomical. These greedy corporations are trying to spike prices and take all this money. We just need to get prices lowered, calm the economy down, slow things down so the prices can settle. 9-year-old daughter in the back seat chimes in, says, that's not accurate. It's because the Federal Reserve is printing a bunch of money. And so she had read our Creature from Jekyll Island book. She knew that the core reason behind inflation is the growth of basically printing or creating money. The dad had read it with her. So he had that same. This is actually an important thing to unpack a little bit. There's a lot of groups, the Ayn Rand Institute and others that go into the schools and distribute literature. And to that, I say, we absolutely need to do that. I'm not going to knock that. We ourselves in years past did that. Let's find teachers. Let's support them with books and resources. I would go in and give class presentations and school assemblies on iPencil. I would bring like a big 2-foot long functional pencil, a block of cedar wood, a copper ingot, yellow paint. And we would talk about how pencils are made, of course, using Leonard Read's famous story, iPencil, which we turned into the Tuttle Twins and the Miraculous Pencil. So we would do all these efforts in school trying to teach these kids. And to simplify and summarize what would happen, let's say a 9-year-old kid is in a class where they learn for 45 minutes about free enterprise and what that means and how it works. Kid goes home. Mom says, hey, sweetie, how was your day? Fine. Oh, learn anything interesting? I don't know. Right. And so there's a disconnect in the home between parents and kids. So there's no reinforcing of the idea. There's no building upon it. There's no application of it. By contrast, so we pivoted. Our model is like 99% direct to family. We want mom and dad engaged with, or, grandpa or trusted uncle or whoever. We want an adult in the child's life to share this story reading time or cartoon watching time so that they have a shared language, so that when the 9-year-old hears on the radio some crackpot economist claiming that it's Taylor Swift's fault, for inflation, that 9-year-old daughter or 9-year-old girl can kind of push back against that, but the dad can be on the same wavelength and they could have an age appropriate, contextual,
Sure.
relevant conversation about it. And the final thing I'll say, Amy, in response to that, it's a very fair and good question. I appreciate you asking it. The example that I'll share in reply is I think of Thanksgiving dinner. When you're a kid, let's say you're kind of like 11 years old, right? And you're in that awkward phase where do you sit at the adult table or are you stuck with all like the 6 and 8-year-olds at the little kids table, right? Every kid wants to be a big kid. Every teenager wants to be like an adult. And I think my reflection and talking to however many thousands of families now about this is I think we underestimate what kids can learn and want to learn. We generally feed them superficial nonsense crap down at their level rather than challenging them to explore big ideas and things to help them understand the world. Again, I'm not saying to pull them too far outside of what's appropriate for their age or interest, But I do think that generally speaking, many parents underestimate the appetite their kids might have for understanding these big ideas and making sense of the world that they're growing up in. So that's the other thing I would say in reply, is that I think challenging kids to learn some of these ideas can be a healthy thing if done appropriately and right. I've seen a lot of power in it. I've seen kids launching businesses from it. I've seen so many happy parents that, to me, it's a little bit of a testimony of like, okay, we're onto something right here, where we don't want to put the horse too far in front of the cart, but we're generally trying to lead kids in this direction of deeper learning, more so than they're going to get from their curriculum or any other source.
Yeah, and first of all, each child is different, right? So there's
Sure.
going to be some kids who have more of an interest, and then you may as well go ahead and engage with them with
Mhm.
respect to that interest. And yeah, like you say, using opportunity as they come up to take advantage of the context and talk about principles in an age appropriate way. That all sounds good. And you're right, once the cat is out of the bag in a certain way, if you do nothing, then you are just letting whatever's in the default context take over
That's
and
right.
be absorbed by them. So there's that as well. Earlier you said that when you got out of your higher education, when you completed it, that some things happened that made you think it was a waste of time, or what were the things?
Well, first, it was kind of my political awakening. And the short version of that is that I was invited to a screening of a film called America, Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo. This was 2006. Fairly the libertarian guy. He's no longer with us, but he put together this film chronicling, here's this lofty ideal standard of what America was envisioned to be, and look how it's degraded over time. And so he talked about the Federal Reserve, and he talked about the income tax and like all this kinds of stuff. And I'm sitting in this little library with like 15 other people watching this film. And that's the first time I encounter Ron Paul. He was interviewed for the documentary. I'm like, who's this old guy that's just saying all these really wise things? And his name appeared along the bottom. So I did what many have done since, and that is I went home 2006. This is like August, and I Googled Ron Paul. And so
Mhm.
went down that rabbit hole and binged all his C-SPAN stuff, bought his books, read his recommended books, and just started really consuming content on libertarianism, Austrian economics, and all the rest. So I had this kind of political awakening. And somehow along that journey of reading a bunch of books, I was led to a gentleman named John Taylor Gatto. By chance, are you familiar with who that is?
I've heard the name, but that's
His
all.
name
Yeah.
is kind of out there, but yeah, most people don't know him. He's also no longer with us as of a few years ago. He was a 30-year veteran of the New York government education system. And he was kind of one of those renegade teachers that would always buck the trend and fight the system from within, just do whatever he wanted and deal with the flogging. Interestingly, later in his career, and so kids loved him because like he'd say like, "Hey, let's go for a walk to the park, and I'll just talk as we go and answer your questions. Let's get out of here." Or he'd take them on random field trips without jumping through all the administrative hurdles, and he'd just throw them all in a bus and go somewhere interesting. So the kids loved him, the parents loved him. He was doing a good job to like really inspire and educate these kids in a very low income type of environment. And later in his career, he won New York City Teacher of the Year, which, mind you, is given out by like the PTA and the teachers union and the kind of the establishment giving out this award. And so he's this renegade, libertarian-minded teacher. He gets the New York City award. The following year, he gets the New York State Teacher of the Year award. And in that same
Wow.
year, he writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "I Quit, I Think," in which he goes on to say that I can't stand this anymore. Try as I might to work from within the system, I'm quitting. And if anyone knows of a profession where I can help kids without also hurting them, please let me know. And so he quits,
Wow.
goes on to write a bunch of books, goes on a public speaking tour. This is in the 80s when homeschooling, like the laws finally loosen up on homeschooling with the court battles, and homeschooling starts to take off. And so to come back to the issue, I read his book, Dumbing Us Down, to get to our earlier discussion. It's called Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Education. And I read that. I was dating this girl seriously at the time, who's my now wife. And I read that book. It's a short book, but he talks about, from his perspective, how broken the schools are and why they're broken. And so he rattles off all these examples, and I'm reading this book. I'm like, this is exactly why I struggled with school. Right? I hated the requirement of conformity. I hated that it felt
Right.
prison-like. I hated that I had to learn the same things as everybody else, stuff I didn't care about. Who cares if the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell? Why was I forced to memorize that? So I read his book, and I'm like, hey, to my girlfriend, now wife, I'm like, and we were really serious. We were heading towards marriage. And I'm like, hey, like, when we have kids, this should be, we should homeschool. And so that became like the beginning of my educational shift, to realize that I had gone through a very inefficient and unproductive, experience. And for my own future children, I wanted something different. I had to then go learn what that was. So then I went on a journey of learning about, how we can actually truly educate people, how we really learn as humans, and what alternatives exist to help families pursue as opposed to the status quo.
And that was the beginning of your current career then, where you're focusing on helping others educate their children as well. Yeah. So, so Libertas Institute is focused mostly on this, or are there other projects that you're doing as well?
So I started our group in 2011. So 13 years ago. And at the time, it was focused on just being a state-based think tank here in Utah, where I set it up. So we were working on state laws in Utah on a lot of these issues. So education freedom, legalizing homeschooling. But a lot of it was like, broad libertarian type of policy reform. So a lot of criminal justice, property rights, business regulation. We've since grown in the years past to work across the country. So we use Utah as what we call a policy incubator. We've changed over 100 laws here on a wide range of topics, and 23 of them, I think, are first of their kind in the whole country. So we pride ourselves on being a very innovative policy reform group, coming up with fresh new ideas to solve old problems. So now what we do is we export those victories to other states, and we've got relationships with think tanks and advocacy groups and elected officials in all the states who can then go take our model legislation and our research and our talking points and our marketing materials, and they can go implement it in their state. So on the policy side, it's kind of across the board, traditional libertarian stuff, but not like a Cato Institute or a Heritage or AEI, where they kind of mostly talk about things and analyze things. Ours is more of a tactical group where we do just enough research and just enough kind of intellectual stuff to then make sure here's the right idea, here's how to implement it. But then it's very action driven and saying, let's actually go get this done and make an impact, make a change. So that's kind of how we're structured. And so Tuttle Twins and other projects are part of this umbrella organization that we've set up to, as I said earlier, change hearts, minds, and then laws.
What are sort of forefront of your policy agendas right now? What are the policies that you're working on?
So one big one right now is what's called portable benefits. We have a labor system that is decades old, built out of World War II, when they put they froze the salary increases during the war. And so companies, to get creative, started offering other benefits. And so the current regime we have, where your benefits are locked into your employer, and if you quit, you lose your benefits and so forth, that's an outgrowth of the war. So portable benefits is this vision where, much like a 401k that you can, like, it's still yours and you can roll it over into the next one at your next employer. Let's set up benefits programs that are tied to the individual and not the company. So we're starting that at a state level. We got the first portable benefits law passed in Utah, and this is specifically for gig workers. So you can think of like your Uber driver or DoorDash or whatever. Now those companies can contribute to a benefits plan for their workers, even though they're contractors, and to not make them be seen as a W-2 employee versus a 1099 contractor. So this is going to be revolutionary for the kind of contractor, gig economy, flexible, working type of industry, where these people who are maybe driving for Uber and doing, Postmates or whatever, they can support themselves. They can have a truly living wage. They can have benefits, and the companies can contribute to that for their little gig workers without crossing that line. So that's kind of a big innovative new thing that we're working on. Another one is micro school protection. So we got the first law in the country passed just recently in Utah on that. The issue here is that post-COVID, we had the pandemic pods, that a lot of people learned what those were. Really now they've morphed more into what are called micro schools. So these are very like small private schools. Sometimes they're like homeschool co-ops,
Right.
slash whatever. The problem that a lot of these entities are running into across the country is local zoning type laws, parking issues, fire
Mm,
code. We had a guy in southern Utah who spent over $100,000 just on legal fees, permit fees, legal costs for his attorneys, doing battle against the city just to even get a permit to build not build, renovate a building and then operate. And all of this money just totally wasted in pursuit of a permission slip because the city didn't know how to classify this new concept. What's a micro school? So they said, well, we think you're a child care center. And here's all these decades of regulations for child care centers that you
right.
need to have this and that and that. Okay, $80,000 later, you'll be in compliance. So we created in Utah a statewide definition of what these micro school type of organizations are. And then we said they are what's called a permitted use across the state. So what that means for zoning laws, they can go into commercial zones, industrial zones, residential zones, people's basements. A lot of these people are like a former teacher who got sick of the system. They've got a basement. They can set up, 2 or 3 little classes, invite another teacher or two to help them. And now they've got their own micro school. They're making more money than they did in the system before. They have total freedom. And so there's a lot of these like loosey-goosey education,
Right.
entrepreneurial things happening. So our law basically says, leave these people alone, give them a light touch, let them do what they're doing. And so that's one now that we're going to hopefully take to other states as well, to support these education entrepreneurs in this new landscape. So stuff like that. We really try and find in the marketing world, there's this concept of red ocean and blue ocean. Red ocean is like you throw chum in the water and there's sharks and just it's a feeding frenzy and it's very competitive. Blue ocean is, you throw the chum on the other side and there's no sharks around. It's just an open field and lots of opportunity. So we tend to focus on blue ocean opportunities. What are issues that, are in our wheelhouse, align with our values, but no one else is really working on them. And if we bring our kind of creative problem solving to it, we can come up with something that we can then go help other organizations do. So that's kind of the approach that we take.
Those are good examples, and it sounds like you're doing a lot of good by getting those implemented. The thought that kept coming to my mind is if we just had pure freedom of contract in our country, none of that would be necessary because people could just make whatever contracts that they wanted to
Totally.
do what their use case was of a particular building or piece of land or whatever. If a employer wanted to contribute to an employee's whatever, without it becoming a W-2 employee and all these straitjackets that the law implements. It's insane that you have to jump through so many hoops to just allow people to make contracts with terms on which they voluntarily agree, don't you think?
I do think you are not
Yeah.
wrong in the slightest. And so much of my work is, I look at the libertarian movement more broadly, and there's a lot of, purism battles and infighting all the time about who's the, most ordained and amazing libertarian. And in a decade plus ago, I would join in those squabbles and I would debate the finer, points of our ideology and so forth. And then I realized, like, as steam, like we're letting off steam. We're just doing these debates and we're talking about esoteric things. But if you took all that steam, all that energy that we're letting off and harnessed it, like steams can move locomotives. We could actually make some progress if we could find a way to channel that energy. So I get it. Sometimes we are accused by our libertarian purist friends of like, oh, you're a sellout for this, or you did that, or whatever. I'm like, look, I'm with you, Amy. What you just said, I completely resonate. I
Mhm.
pine the day in which we could have freedom of contract and just have that be the solution. But then on the other hand, I'm like, okay, well, in the meantime, right, we got all these people who are being screwed by the government. Can we
Mhm.
lighten the degree to which they're being screwed a little bit? And if no one else is helping them, maybe we can. So it's definitely like you get your hands a little dirty and you don't feel necessarily like a pure libertarian. We did a medical marijuana law in Utah 6 years ago. No one thought we'd pass it. The Mormon church here has very strong feelings about those types of
Mhm.
things. And they, 80% of the legislature is Mormon, as I am myself. And so everyone's like, no, it's not going to go for that very conservative state. Well, we got it done. And that's a very long story. But okay, well, here's my ADHD kicking in. Now I have to remember like why the heck I was even
The purest point.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
See, there you go.
Yeah.
You're rescuing me. So, I had, some of my like hippie, libertarian, pot smoking, whatever buddies. They're like, oh, it should be decriminalization only. There should be no war on drugs. We should abolish the Controlled Substance Act. And I'm like, thumbs up all day long. I totally agree with you. Like, I'm on board. But how are you going to get that done? And in the meantime, like, I can make massive progress, pull tens of thousands of patients out of the criminal justice system so their kids aren't being taken by DCFS and they're not losing their jobs and their gun rights. So in the meantime, I'm going to focus on where we can actually make the impact, even though like, hey, I'll go debate with you, on the weekend, some of these more esoteric things. But that gets back to my criticism of the movement, where I just see a lot of inefficiency and plenty of people talking about ideas, which we need the intellectuals and we need people talking about ideas. I'm not trying to knock that generally, but I feel like too many people optimize for that and engage in that, when it's like, if you took even a third of that energy that you spend on, debates and Twitter hot takes and so forth, and actually found ways to like move the ball forward, we could actually, cover a lot of ground, and that would be amazing to see. But I don't see a lot of that in our movement, which frustrates me.
I'm going to ask you, if it's okay, one last question. People who are listening say that this is so interesting, they're just listening. So I'm not getting questions from the viewers at this point. But to you, when you talk about liberty, so liberty is, you say, what animates everything that you do, trying to further that. What do you define liberty to mean?
So I tend to take a very kind of inclusive, I think, approach to this, and not have a very kind of narrow definition. I get people who are like, well, freedom and liberty are different things. And I'm like, look, I get it. But my kind of general philosophy on this, Jefferson had this quote where he says, and I'm not going to say it exactly, but the gist is that, liberty is the right to do anything you please, so long as you don't infringe upon the rights of others. And so that's my general approach. I think the state is inherently evil. We did a book based off of Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. I don't think I have it right here next to me, but we called it The Tuttle Twins and the Fate of the Future. And we're talking about, the evils of the state and why voluntary cooperation is superior to coercive means. And we thought when we did that book that we'd have, an uproar from parents like, oh my gosh, you're advancing this like hardcore, perspective.
Anarchist kind of perspective,
yeah,
right?
and like literally not a single complaint. If anything, tons of feedback of like, wow, that was really interesting. It made me think in ways I'd never thought before. So that's why I try and have a very, like, I try and be very inviting in my definition of liberty, in my approach to advancing liberty, because I realize that the millions of people out there are on that journey where I was an idiot before. I was just a typical conservative Republican, superficially understanding, mostly ignorant person, just programmed on the conveyor belt. So I want to be very inclusive, very open to people saying, hey, look, you think liberty is, pledging allegiance to the flag, even though the pledge was written by a socialist, and you think Abraham Lincoln was great, even though like I think he was a tyrant in a lot of ways. That's fine. We'll get to that in a few months. First, let's talk about this next incremental thing that can help you on your path. So my position on liberty is, just generally, I think people should be free to do what they want. I think we should have freedom of contract, voluntary relationships. I think everything the state does, it corrupts and creates more problems. And so generally speaking, I just think we need to significantly reduce and then hopefully abolish the state. And in the meantime, and I will say one thing, Amy, here that I don't think gets emphasized enough in our movement. And I think, the opposite, the other side of the coin of liberty is personal responsibility. And so we can't just go out there and preach liberty and demand our rights if we are not also kind of building and promoting a society in which we're taking care of ourselves, and I think taking care of one another, and having what Alexis de Tocqueville called intermediating institutions, where people are able to have that strong, true social safety net and not a state-created unsafety net. And so, yes, liberty is important to me, but I think so too is creating people who are critically thinking, who are competent, who are hardworking, who are helpful to others, who are trying to create value in their community, in their life, and living that personal responsibility where they're going to desire to be free, and then they're going to have the capacity to act on that freedom, and then spread it to others. So I think those two things go together. I'll stop yapping. Those are my thoughts.
No, it's fine. Now, the episode that I did watch of the Tuttle Twins cartoon didn't convey the idea that there shouldn't be government. It was about government actually protecting your rights to life, liberty, and property. And
Yep.
that if it wasn't doing that, then the laws would actually be a force for evil. But you actually go further than that in your own personal beliefs. Is that right?
Yeah, like I said, I want to be inviting. So in the cartoons and the books, I'm gonna, move people along and say, look, at a minimum, the government needs to be protecting life, liberty, and property. So let's have a conversation about what that means, what natural rights are, that just governments exist with the consent of the government to secure our rights. So let's move them to that understanding. And then once they're there and with me, then I can say, okay, now let's talk about how the state is just a fundamentally immoral evil, and why voluntary cooperation is best. I'm not going to start at the end point and just try and like scare people off and look pure and feel good about myself. I do want to lead people on the same journey that I had to go on myself. And that just means this kind of incremental next step perspective on challenging their assumptions, slaying a few sacred cows, warming them up to our perspective, and then leading them down that path of deeper understanding.
Okay. Well, I think maybe at some point we'll have to continue the conversation because I'm not at the point where you are. I think government done right is a necessary good. I'm still in that camp. And so maybe someday we can continue and talk about that. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Okay. Well, I thank you again for your time. Do you have any, kind of parting thoughts? We're going into Independence Day tomorrow.
Yeah, I think this is streamed live, right? So people are watching it
It
now.
is.
So we're doing an Independence Day sale right now. If you go to TuttleTwins.com/history, we've got two beefy books, storybooks on American history. Actually, we were inspired by Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, where he had kind of a more libertarian-minded perspective on a lot of that stuff. So we've incorporated some of those ideas. And so we've got history books and curriculum and audiobooks. So right now, being Independence Day week, I think it's like 70% off. So that's at
Oh, wow.
TuttleTwins.com/history. And then, of course, TuttleTwins.com for all the other books. The cartoon, if people are curious about that one, the easy way to get there is TuttleTwins.tv. And that'll take you to where you can go watch totally for free seasons 1 and 2. We're just now starting season 3. And hopefully we'll have many more seasons to come.
Yeah, and I noticed that all of them are free, and it's because you have an active donor base that gets personally involved, as far as I can tell. Yes.
It's free because we partner with Angel Studios, which is a distribution company, and their whole model is the cartoon is a for-profit spinoff, so that's not part of our nonprofit. So we raised a lot of money to finance seasons 1 and 2, and then we sell merchandise and other things to sustain the ongoing operations of future seasons. So it's still with support, but it's just in a different. It's not philanthropy as it is with our books and some of our other programs.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Someone says, I've seen this dude on Corbet before. So yeah, I think I have seen you make the rounds, and I'm glad to have finally spoken with you in person. Thanks so much.
It's great chatting with you, Amy. I appreciate your time.
Take care.